In 1995, 11-year-old Lacey Phillips lived with her mother, Mary, her father, James, and her older siblings. Brother Jesse, who was 15 at the time, and sister Darla, who was 17. The family was very close-knit and had a strong bond. The Phillips family lived in their own home in a small town called Bald Knob, Arkansas, which they had moved to 5 years earlier from Hope, Arkansas. They considered Bald Knob an ideal place for family life and raising children. Mary was known as a loving mother and wife, fond of gardening, outdoor recreation. The Phillips family was a typical American family, slowly building their happiness, unaware of how cruelly it would eventually be destroyed. On June 6, 1995, 11-year-old Lacey was under the supervision of her older sister, Darla. Both were students, but summer vacation had begun. Their mothers go to work during this time, and often the children will stay at home waiting for their parents to return. However, at 4 p.m. that day, Lacey had an appointment with the dentist, which coincided with Mary's end of her work shift. Consequently, Darla drove Lacey to the workplace, where their mother worked as an accountant in an automated tax and accounting service. It was planned that Lacey would wait until her mother finished work and then go to the appointment together. Darla later described this outing as completely ordinary. She talked with Mary for a while, and then Darla went home, planning to meet her friends later. She and her mother said goodbye and hugged, unaware that this would be their last meeting. Although Mary and Lacey were expected to be a little late coming back from the dentist, it was merely a routine checkup that wasn't supposed to take long. Meanwhile, Jesse and Darla were left alone at home. Their father was on a business trip 500 kilometers away. The siblings expected their mother and Lacey to return by 5 p.m., but as much more time passed with no sign of mother, they began to worry. At around 6 p.m., both teenagers grew increasingly worried as neither returned from the dentist's office. Lacey is too young to have her own plans, and Mary had no other plans for the evening. Even if something had changed, Mary always called the children to inform them if she would be late. Her uncharacteristic absence without warning heightened their concern. Darla assumed her mother might be late at work, so she called the office but received no answer. Concerned, she then headed to the dental clinic, but there was no sign of Mary or Lacey. Time passed, and as the sun began to set, Darla contacted their father to share their growing worries. He suggested they leave the house and look around the area, considering that Mary's car might have broken down or she might need help. Jesse and Darla searched the vicinity but found nothing. They returned to their house and reported their findings to their father, prompting him to contact the police. A dispatch officer spoke to James to gather necessary information. He provided details about where Mary worked, the car she drove, and their trip to the dentist set for around 4 p.m. The most alarming fact was that Mary and Lacey never reached the dentist. Law enforcement took James's report seriously, confirming that no one had arrived at the dental office. Around midnight, an officer was dispatched to check Mary's workplace. Upon arrival at the parking lot in front of the building, the patrolman noticed a pickup truck parked alone. After checking the license plate, he confirmed it was indeed Mary Phillips' vehicle. This discovery intensified fears that something had gone terribly wrong. The car was intact and locked, so the officer decided to check the office where Mary worked. He knocked on the door, which surprisingly opened because it was unlocked. Upon entering, he found the lights were off and had to use a flashlight to explore. It was then that he discovered something horrifying: the body of a woman covered in blood, with her hands tightly bound behind her back. A cord from a household appliance was wrapped around her neck, and her clothes were pulled down. The officer immediately realized she had been brutally beaten. A pulse check indicated she was dead. The body was cold, suggesting she had been killed hours earlier. The office resembled the aftermath of a violent struggle, with blood scattered around, intensifying concerns that the perpetrator might still be present. The patrolman called for reinforcements and continued to carefully inspect the rooms while waiting for his colleagues to arrive. He checked the office and then moved to the utility rooms, where he noticed a trail of blood leading to another door, which was also unlocked. He entered without any problems and saw a gruesome scene. In the middle of the room was a chair to which a girl was tied, also covered in blood. There was especially a lot of blood. Her face showed clear signs of having received several blows to the head. Thought the girl was dead, he managed to take several pictures of the second victim when she suddenly woke up, opened her eyes, and looked in his direction. Later, the police officer recalled this moment as one of the most terrible and unexpected in his life, as if he had seen a dead person returning to life. The patrolman immediately turned to his colleagues and, in addition to requesting reinforcements, asked them to call for doctors. He freed the girl and tried to provide first aid, but it quickly became obvious that she was in serious condition and that only doctors could fully help her. Despite her injuries, she was conscious and could speak. She clearly stated that her name was Lacey Phillips. The only thing that worried her was her mother's condition. She asked several times what had happened to Mary and if everything was okay with her, but the policeman distracted her from these troubling thoughts, not telling her the truth. The medics arrived a few minutes later, and Lacey was urgently taken to the nearest medical facility. On the way, she regained consciousness and then lost it again. Lacey had sustained a serious head injury from several strong blows to the head with a blunt object. Additionally, marks were found on her neck indicating strangulation, and in addition to sustaining a fracture in her cranial vault, she had a broken jaw. Mary's husband, James, was notified that something had happened to his loved ones but was given no details. He immediately packed his things and left for the city to see his daughter in the hospital to support her. He was shocked and did not understand what had happened to his family. Now, the doctors did not dare to provide a prognosis on whether the Phillips' youngest daughter, Lacey, would survive. An even greater blow was the death of 34-year-old Mary. She could not be saved and had died before the patrolman arrived. Forensic experts worked at the crime scene but were unable to find any clues that would lead to the criminal. Their only hope was Lacey, who had miraculously survived the attack, and they awaited news from the medical center with excitement. A few hours later, doctors managed to stabilize Lacey's condition. The morning after the attack, on June 7th, she woke up in hospital. She was in the intensive care unit, and they were finally able to communicate. Despite her traumatic brain injury, she remembered perfectly what had happened. Later, Lacey admitted that all of it was captured in her memory. Lacey began to recount the frightening details of how her older sister had taken her to their mother's workplace at about 3 p.m. She remained in the office until 3:45 p.m., as both of them were getting ready to go to the dentist's office for a routine checkup. The workday was almost over. But a few minutes before it ended, an unfamiliar man entered the office. He immediately headed to the desk where Mary worked. She and Mary looked at him and even stepped back. There was something frightening in his gaze, but they thought he was just a client who had come into the office. When the stranger raised his hands, it became obvious that he was not there for advice. He was wearing latex gloves. In one hand, he held a roll of wire, and in the other, a gun with which he threatened Mary and Lacey. The man announced that it was a robbery. Mary tried to cover herself and protect her daughter, but he pushed Mary's aside, knocked her to the floor, and began tying her wrists behind her back with the wire. Lacey was confused, scared, and unable to react. Everything happened too quickly. After tying up Mary, the unknown man shouted at Lacey and ordered her to follow him into another room. He brought a chair from Mary's office, placed it in the middle of the room, and forced she to sit on it while he tied her hands to the chair behind her back. She cried, begged him not to harm her and her mother. The criminal said he would not harm Mary but would hurt her daughter. After securing Lacey to the chair with wire, he immediately hit her hard on the head with the handle of the pistol. Her eyes went dark, and she lost consciousness. After which, the stranger left the room, closing the door behind him. Lacey was left alone. She was tightly tied up and couldn't even move. She felt like she was bleeding from her head. Lacey regained consciousness a few minutes later, looked around, and saw that blood was all around the chair. She was in pain, but she couldn't imagine the extent of the head injury she had sustained. She began to scream and call for help, hoping that her mother would enter the room and untie her. The door swung open, and to her horror, it was the same man again. He was furious that she was still alive and screamed, striking she again before grabbing her by the neck and beginning to strangle her until she lost consciousness once more. This lasted for several minutes. Perhaps the criminal was afraid of being caught, so he wanted to escape from the building as quickly as possible. He believed he had killed Lacey, turned off the light, and left the room. The criminal immediately fled the office. Several hours passed. Lacey came to her senses but then lost consciousness again. Each time she regained consciousness, she tried to get free and call for her mother but received no response. Her hands were tightly bound with metal wire. Lacey grew weaker with every minute. The only hope for salvation was the thought that someone would find them. About 8 hours passed, during which Lacey remained locked in the dark room, bleeding. She was half asleep, could barely move, and had lost all strength. Suddenly, the girl heard a faint clicking sound coming from the next room. At first, she was scared that it was the attacker, but then the sounds were repeated next to her, and flashes appeared in her half-asleep state. Lacey realized it looked like a photo shoot. She confirmed it when she opened her eyes and saw someone taking her picture. Fortunately, it was not the criminal. It was a policeman who had arrived at the office to check on Lacey. Lacey remembered how the ambulance had arrived, how the policeman freed her. She was losing and regaining consciousness on the way to the intensive care unit of the nearest children's hospital. All this time, the doctors talked to her to keep her conscious. At each moment of clarity, Lacey tried to find out what had happened to her mother, but she never received an answer to any of her questions. Even now, while talking to the police, she still did not know that Mary was dead. After the police visit to the hospital, her father, brother, and sister came into the ward. They brought balloons and soft toys. Lacey still believed that her mother, like her, was in the hospital and had probably also suffered at the hands of the attacker but was still alive. The whole day of June 7th, Lacey's relatives spent with she, but they never answered any of her questions about Mary. She saw how, with each passing moment, her father's eyes filled with tears. Doubt began to creep in, but at that time, Lacey was still too weak and simply pushed away the bad thoughts. In the evening, James gathered his strength, went up to his daughter, knelt down, and hugged her. In a trembling voice, he told her that Mary was now in heaven with her great-grandmother. The detective leading the investigation could not afford to be sentimental, as the criminal responsible for the attack was still on the loose and might strike again. The local residents were in danger, and the bloodthirsty killer had to be stopped urgently. When Lacey found out about this, she realized with horror that she was the only chance for the police to catch the criminal. She also understood that she was in great danger and that the attacker might return to eliminate her as an unwanted witness. In the office where he committed the murder and attempted murder, the stranger left no traces. He managed to avoid leaving evidence by using latex gloves, which Lacey reported. However, he left biological fluids after abusing Mary, but their examination would take time, and the research capabilities of that era were much more modest. Therefore, the results only allowed the police to limit the circle of suspects, which at that point was not substantial. The criminal was likely an experienced killer. He knew how to avoid being caught, acted covertly, and used gloves. However, the police still had the main source of information, Lacey. She remembered the attacker perfectly and provided a very detailed description, including the smallest details of his clothing, appearance. Having learned that this man had taken her mother away from her, she was determined to bring him to justice. Describing the face of the criminal, Lacey suddenly recalled one important detail. Before he struck her on the head, while he had tied her hands with metal wire, she noticed a teardrop tattoo on his face, as well as a tattoo on his arm. This detail allowed the detectives to match these distinctive features with registered criminals. Detectives quickly identified a 31-year-old man named Jack Jones, who had the tattoos described by Lacey. Jack was well known to the local police for multiple robbery charges, but investigators did not suspect that he was responsible for much more serious crimes. The police quickly discovered Jack Jones's last known residence and went to apprehend him, expecting that he might already be on the run. To their surprise, Jack personally opened the door, did not seem alarmed at all. He was immediately brought to the station for questioning. While being taken to the department, detectives contemplated what tactics to employ to get the criminal to talk. To their surprise, no tricks were needed. As soon as Jack was asked about Mary and Lacey, he calmly began to recount what had happened. He stated that he had seen Mary standing in her office early that same day while he was driving past. As soon as it happened, he decided that he wanted to kill her because he found her incredibly beautiful. He returned later, knowing that the office closed around 4 p.m., when there should have been no one there. However, he saw a girl there but did not retreat. He tied up Lacey in the room because he was not interested in her. His goal from the very beginning was Mary. He bound her hands behind her back, placed her on the floor, abused her, and then cut a cord from the kettle, wrapped it around her neck, and began to strangle her. According to Jack Jones, this murder was an act of revenge for the abuse of his wife, as her attacker remained unpunished. The investigation revealed that Jack's wife did report the crime to the police, but later she retracted her statement against the abuser, leading to his release. Jack insisted that his wife was indeed abused, but why Mary had to pay for it remained a mystery. On the evening of June 7, 1995, Jack Jones was arrested for the abuse and murder of Mary. He was also charged with the attempted murder of Lacey. When the Phillips family was informed, everyone breathed a sigh of relief, as no one could be sure that the killer wouldn't come back to eliminate the only witness. However, their fight was just beginning, as Jack still had to be brought to justice in court. Thanks to his confession, there should not be any problems. Lacey did not want to attend the hearings to avoid further trauma, but the existing evidence against him was enough to send him to prison. The trial began in April of 1996. By that time, law enforcement officials had carefully reviewed all the evidence against Jack. It was decided to show in court a recording of Lacey's account, made on a dictaphone while she was recovering from her injuries in the hospital. She quickly recovered physically, but psychologically she was broken. However, even in such a state, she wanted justice. The defense attorney tried to refute her statement, but the jury did not believe him. The defendant himself pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity, claiming that he was not himself during the attack on the mother and daughter because he was treating his bipolar disorder with illegal drugs. His arguments about a difficult childhood were also unconvincing. Ultimately, the jury found Jack Jones guilty on all counts. For the murder of Mary Phillips, he was sentenced to death by lethal injection. For the brutal beating of Lacey, he received a life sentence along with an additional 30 years and a fine of $15,000 for the attempted murder of Lacey. But this was not the end of Jack's criminal story. While on death row, he confessed to another murder, that of 32-year-old Lori Barrett. This incident occurred during her 5-day vacation in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, where she planned to visit friends. Because she arrived late, she didn't want to bother her friend's family and decided to stay at a hotel instead. That evening, Barrett went to a local bar to relax after her trip. There, she met a young man with several tattoos. According to several witnesses who spoke to the police, Barrett was seen drinking with the stranger until about 2 a.m. in the hotel patio. After that, they went up in the elevator together, presumably to her room. The next day, she failed to show up for a planned barbecue with her friend. Later, a cleaning lady went to her room and found her body, which had been abused and strangled. Jack Jones confessed to this murder in 2005, claiming that he liked Barrett right away, and they spent the whole evening together before going up to her room. However, the details of what happened next and the reason for the attack remain unknown, as Jack refused to disclose them. For the trial related to this case, he was extradited to Florida and received a life sentence without the possibility of parole, after which he was returned to Arkansas to await execution. Interestingly, Jack Jones could have been caught and convicted of this crime while it was still being committed. A composite sketch was created based on witness statements and footage from the hotel's security cameras. His sister identified him after seeing the sketch in a newspaper and showed it to their father, who insisted that she never talk about the event or show Jack's image to anyone else. She complied, remaining silent. Jack's father then put him on a bus and sent him to Arkansas to prevent anyone from recognizing him based on the composite sketch. Unfortunately, it cost Mary Phillips her life. When Jack's family was questioned about the story, they admitted that they knew their son had met with Barrett before the attack but did not believe that Jack could be involved in such a brutal crime. Consequently, the father decided not to contact the police. They described Jack as a very complex person who grew increasingly gloomy and cruel with age, taking out his anger not only on his siblings but also on his parents. However, they justified his behavior until the last moment, believing he could be loving and gentle. They did not think he was capable of murder. On April 24, 2017, 52-year-old Jack Jones was executed for the murder of Mary Phillips at the Cummins unit, along with abuser-murderer Marcel Williams, marking the first double execution in the country in 17 years. Jones and Williams were 2 of 4 inmates executed in Arkansas in April 2017, the other 2 being convicted murderers Liddell Lee and Kenneth Williams. Jones's last meal consisted of fried chicken, fries with tartar sauce, beef jerky, 3 candy bars, a chocolate milkshake, and juice. Lacey, now grown, was present at the execution. When Jack was given his last words, he turned to the victim's daughter, tenderly called her by name, and claimed that he had perceived her as his daughter all his life. Naturally, this only caused her disgust and anger. After the execution, it was revealed that Jack Jones was involved in another murder. Just before his execution, he gave his sister a letter he had written in 2006, with instructions to open it a year after his execution. She respected his request. When she finally opened the letter from her brother, she read a terrible confession. On May 2, 1983, 20-year-old Regina Harrison left her house in the evening to ride her bike. At that time, 19-year-old Jack Jones was riding his bike towards the beach. He meets Regina, who catches his eye, and secretly follows her to a deserted street, where he attacks, abuses, and kills her. They began to search for her that same evening after Regina did not return home at the appointed time. The next day, her body was found in a nearby park with signs of abuse and strangulation, which became the cause of death. During the investigation of this crime, detectives found a witness who identified the criminal as Ronald Stewart, who was passing by the park at the approximate time of the murder. In January of 1985, Ronald pleaded guilty and was then sentenced to 50 years in prison. He died behind bars of cancer in 2008. It later turned out that the only reason an innocent man took the blame was that Ronald Stewart had already committed a series of abuses of other girls. He had been convicted of those crimes and was now afraid of the death penalty, so he made a deal with the prosecution and pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. Ronald never denied his guilt during his lifetime, but DNA testing later showed that he was not guilty of Regina's murder. After Jack Jones' sister, Lynn, went to the police and handed over the letter confessing to the murder, DNA testing was conducted, and in February 2019, his words were officially confirmed: Jack was behind Regina's murder. Before the execution, he lost one of his legs due to diabetes. He stated that he was ready to die, and it remains unknown why he confessed to the murders of Mary and Barrett but did not do the same regarding Regina Harrison until he only mentioned it in a letter to his sister. After the execution, it became official that Jack had killed at least 3 young women. Law enforcement officials now believe that he could have been involved in more brutal crimes. Mary's widower, after Jack's death, spoke out against people who expressed support for the criminal. There were supporters of the killer who believed that he deserved a lighter sentence and demanded that the execution be canceled. However, James said that he did not believe they would have maintained such a loyal attitude towards the criminal if he had killed their loved ones. Lacey, after talking to journalists, said that she could finally move on with her life. Justice had finally prevailed, and this dangerous criminal would no longer be able to harm anyone. However, even despite the execution, she believed that she would never be able to completely free herself from the consequences of the horror she had endured. Hello, crime enthusiasts! Are you ready for another chilling investigation? The case of Benno Numer. In today's story, we focus on the Numer family, who live in Balna, a city in northern Italy. The family consists of parents Peter Numer and Laura Perselli. Their son Benno is 30 years old, and their daughter Maid is 27 years old. Benno is a doctor who has completed his university education and is dedicated to fitness. His father, Peter, is 63 years old, and his mother, Laura, is 68 years old, both retired from teaching at school. Despite their age, They are still active in social and cultural activities. The family is respected in the community. On January 4, 2021, Laura and Peter suddenly disappeared. They were last seen that morning when they went to the supermarket. Laura was planning to visit her mother, who had just returned home from the hospital. Laura rode her bike to her mother's house. A few hours later, Laura's sister sent her a short video of their sick mother, but Laura never opened the message. At the same time, Laura's daughter Maid was on vacation with a friend outside the city and sent her mother a photo but received no response. Benno called his mother at 8:30 that evening, but she did not answer. 3 minutes later, he sent a voice message to his girlfriend, Martina, expressing his concern that he had not been able to reach his parents. He told her that he would be at her house in about an hour or two for dinner as planned, and that he would be late. Benno asked her to call him back later on a regular phone line instead of WhatsApp because he did not have an internet connection. Martina called him back shortly afterwards, and they arranged to meet at 10:12 p.m. When Benno arrived at her house in his father's car, he said he had forgotten to shower. He went to wash his face and asked Martina if she could do his laundry. She didn't ask any questions and agreed to help. Benno gave Martina a bag full of dirty clothes. She didn't check the contents and threw them in the washing machine. The couple then had a great evening at the bar and a passionate night at her house. Benno didn't leave his girlfriend's house until 5:30 a.m. When he was with her at around 11 p.m., he sent his mother a short text message wishing her a good night. He noticed that she hadn't read it, but he was too busy that evening to think about it. Early in the morning of January 5, Laura's sister came to her house. She knocked on the door and rang the bell, but there was no response. It was clear that no one was home. Laura's sister was worried and called Benno to ask about Laura and Peter. However, Benno said he was not home and did not know where they were. Laura's sister was busy taking care of her sick mother and could not leave her alone, so she asked Benno to try to find them. Benno promised to help and suggested that their parents might have gone to the mountains, as they often did. He advised them to wait a few days. Meanwhile, Laura's daughter, Maid, was at the resort with her friend and boyfriend. She noticed that her messages had been ignored, which made her suspicious. She called her dad and was surprised when he didn't answer. His social media pages also showed unread messages, and she couldn't reach her parents, which made her even more worried. So Maid called her brother Benno, who said he was walking his dog in the mountains a few kilometers away from their parents' house, and he couldn't check on them. He seemed worried throughout the call, and his story sounded strange. The dog was very old and sick, barely moving even in their yard, so it was hard to believe he could hike several kilometers into the mountains with the dog. Unable to get more information from Benno, Maid decided to ask a neighbor who lived next door to her parents for help around 1:30 p.m. The neighbor was home, so she agreed to check on her parents. The neighbor knocked on the door, and Benno opened it. At that time, the neighbor was still on the phone with Maid. She immediately recognized her brother's voice and was surprised that he had just refused her request to check on her parents. Benno explained that he had rushed back to his parents' house after walking the dog and was now home. Benno said that their parents were not home and insisted that he did not know where they had gone. Maid called all the hospitals in the city because she had a strong feeling that something was wrong with her parents. Eventually, Maid stopped her outing and returned home. She asked Benno if he knew what had happened to their parents, but he said he did not know. He explained that he had spent the previous day with his girlfriend and had only returned home in the morning when their parents were no longer there. Feeling desperate, Maid decided to contact the police to report her parents missing. At this point, Benno began to discourage her from calling the police. He seemed to be stalling for time, but he suggested another approach that he thought would be more effective. So he contacted a friend who was a police officer for advice on how to handle the situation. Benno's friends suggested contacting a search and rescue service that specialized in mountain rescue, but that didn't help either. In the end, May decided to go to the police himself, regardless of whether Benno supported her decision or not. He eventually agreed, and they went to the police station together. The young man told them about his parents' disappearance and suggested that they might have gone into the mountains. He mentioned that an avalanche had occurred in the area they frequented, about a day after they left. He believed that his mother and father might have been buried under the snow. This explanation seemed plausible to the police and became the main focus of the investigation. Laura and Peter were declared missing, and search teams were deployed to the site of the avalanche. Trained dogs were used to search. Despite a thorough search, it took a long time to cover the entire area. The police decided to interview Benno to gather more information. They noticed that he was evasive and increasingly uncomfortable when asked difficult questions, making his behavior seem suspicious. After leaving the office, Benno suddenly displayed a sudden and inexplicable aggression. He attributed this outburst to hunger, fatigue, and stress. The next day, there was still no news from the police about Peter and Laura, prompting May to return to the station. Benno tried to stop her again, insisting that the police needed more time to conduct the search. During this time, another girl named Jasmine contacted Benno. It turned out he was chatting with 3 other people on Tinder, and he was particularly interested in Jasmine, and he showed little interest in the ongoing investigation. On January 6, May returned to the police station. It had been 2 days since her parents had gone missing. Laura and Peter had not contacted her, which made her believe that something had happened to her parents. They usually informed her before they went into the mountains and would prepare carefully for such trips. She felt the need to conduct a more thorough search of the area near their home. The police were actively involved from the beginning. Initially, they focused on the possibility that the couple had gone missing in the mountains. During this time, Benno went to the supermarket with his new girlfriend, Jasmine, where he bought a large amount of hydrogen peroxide, explaining that he needed it to prepare to sell his father's car. Search teams, along with volunteers, were organized to search the areas outside the mountains and around Laura. Despite the large resources and the participation of about 600 people in the search effort, Peter and Laura were still missing. Everyone worked together in the hope of finding them quickly. Finally, May expressed her concerns. She thought about Benno's strange behavior and the fact that their parents had disappeared shortly after she left the city for a short time. During that time, Benno was supposed to be with them, and their relationship was complicated. She suspected that he might know more than he was letting on. The police decided to question Benno again. This time, during questioning, he was overly friendly, which was surprising given his violent reaction after his previous encounter with the police. The officers suspected that he was deliberately controlling his demeanor to avoid revealing any important information. During this time, suspicions grew that Peter and Laura were likely dead, and it was believed that the couple's son, Benno, might be involved. Benno became the prime suspect. May regularly contacted the police, sharing information about Benno and their parents. Benno's behavior was often so rude and aggressive that Laura was afraid to be home alone with him. On January 7, the police tracked Benno down. That day, Jasmine and Benno got into the family car and went to a hardware store where they bought rags, cleaning supplies, a bucket, and hydrogen peroxide. While Benno asked Jasmine to pay for the items, they stopped at a car wash before heading home. The police arrested them there and found all the items they had purchased in the trunk of the car. The car was impounded for further investigation. The police also attempted to confiscate Benno's jacket, but he refused to hand it over. Benno was questioned again that day. Ultimately, he did not provide any useful information, and since there was no evidence against him, he was released. Although the police confiscated the cleaning kit, Benno and Jasmine decided to clean the house. Benno asked her to wear the jacket the police had asked to confiscate. She did not suspect anything and agreed. After a short while, he took the jacket off Jasmine and put it away. Later that day, the police arrested Jasmine, thinking she might be involved in the case. They questioned her for hours about Peter and Laura's disappearance, but could not find any evidence to link her to the crime. Jasmine is later confronted by the Carabinieri police several times during interrogation, including when Benno's jacket is confiscated. Her hair and skin particles are found on the jacket, forcing her to prove her innocence. She explains that she helped Benno clean the house and wore the jacket, but she was unaware of the implications and risk of harm to herself. On January 17, Maid returns to her parents' house and finds Benno there. She decides to voice her suspicions, which leads to an altercation between them. Maid suggests that Benno may be involved in Peter and Laura's disappearance. He becomes hysterical, shaking as he tries to convince her that she is mistaken. He eventually swears that he had nothing to do with it. Despite his assurances, she remains suspicious of Benno, knowing he is a good liar. Benno tries to justify his actions. However, Maid knew about his troubled relationship with their parents and his aggressive nature. He was the only one capable of causing harm to their loved ones. On January 18, Benno was the prime suspect in the case. The police suspected that he had killed his parents and then hidden their bodies. But the police lacked solid evidence. They only found a small blood stain on the car, not enough to confirm the death of his parents. However, the investigation continued. Important information came to light when Benno's phone was confiscated and examined. Geolocation data from the phone was examined on the evening when Peter and Laura went missing. The data showed that Benno had left the city and stopped near the bridge on the Adige River, where he stayed for a considerable amount of time. The police believed that he may have dumped their bodies there. This location became the focus of the search for evidence. On February 6, 2021, a search operation was launched in the Adige River. Police quickly located Laura's body. However, her husband, Peter, had been missing for more than 3 months. He was finally found on April 27, after Laura's body was discovered on the riverbank. A brown stain that looked like blood was found on the bridge over the river. Forensic experts analyzed the sample and confirmed that it was Peter's blood. Surveillance camera footage captured Benno's car on the evening of the incident as he returned from the bridge to his ex-girlfriend Martina's house, confirming that he was at the scene where the bodies were found. Peter's body was found by forensic experts in relatively good condition. A layer of algae had formed on it, slowing down decomposition, and the cold temperature helped preserve the tissues. This made it easy to spot signs of strangulation on both Peter and his wife. Marks on their necks indicated that they had been attacked from behind. The cause of death was confirmed to be strangulation, and it was determined that they had been thrown into the river after they were dead, as there was no water in their lungs. Given Benno's strong and muscular physique, he was able to overpower his elderly parents without much difficulty. After his parents' bodies were found, Benno admitted that he was involved in their deaths. On the night of the incident, he had an argument with Peter. Benno tried to avoid the argument by locking himself in his room, but his father barged in and continued the argument. In a fit of rage, Benno attacked his father with a rope and strangled him. When Laura heard the noise and went upstairs, he feared that she would call the police, so he strangled her as well. Although his confession seemed credible, his motives seemed too weak to justify such a brutal act. Benno explained that his relationship with his parents had become increasingly strained in the months leading up to the incident, marked by frequent arguments after he moved back in with them. Benno had begun paying rent at his father's request. However, due to the constant arguments, his father decided that it would be best if Benno moved out. He began to encourage his son to rent his own apartment, but Benno refused. To pressure him to move, his father increased the rent to €700. which Benno considered excessive and unfair. That evening, Peter called him a loser for spending too much time on the computer and forced him to walk the dog. Another argument broke out. This conflict escalated into a tragic situation. Benno claims that his father was the first to confront him, trying to kick him out of the house. As a result, Benno felt he had no choice but to defend himself. The investigation revealed that immediately after the murder, Benno began to create an alibi. He called his mother's cell phone, pretending to go looking for her. After the murder, he asked Martina to wash his clothes to erase any evidence. Although she handed the washed clothes over to the police, no incriminating marks were found on them. Police believe that his efforts to conceal the evidence indicate a deliberate act. Not only did Benno understand what he was doing, but he also tried to avoid consequences for this brutal crime. Benno attempted to explain his actions by claiming that he was mentally disturbed and affected by the attack. However, his calm demeanor and careful efforts to conceal evidence of the crime showed that he was fully aware of his actions. After his arrest, psychiatrists evaluated him and determined that he had a personality disorder characterized by narcissism and social problems. He had recently had frequent sudden outbursts of anger, which doctors attributed to his steroid use. Benno began taking additional medication. This led to a significant deterioration in his mental state due to hormonal changes, leading to increased aggression and a complete loss of self-control. Maid said that he would often attack her when angry and was often violent with other family members. On one occasion, she suffered multiple bruises as a result of his aggression. Even as a child, Benno tried to strangle her, but their parents were present at the time. In 2020, Benno entered a relationship with a girl named Nadine, and they moved to Germany together. A friend noted that at first, Benno was very attentive and caring. However, over time, his behavior became controlling, showing signs of selfishness and abusive tendencies. He tried to create distance between Nadine and her family, isolating her from her parents and friends, leaving her to spend most of her time alone. Things got worse when in June 2020, Nadine discovered that Benno had used her credit card without permission and stolen money from her account. This betrayal prompted Nadine to end the relationship. She called Benno's parents and insisted that they pick up their son from her apartment. His parents had to drive to pick him up. Just a day after their return, Benno made amends with Nadine, promising to pay her back and asking her parents to let him go home to Nadine. While Nadine was at work, he sent her a selfie showing him covered in blood. Benno claimed he had gotten into a fight with a friend named Dean. However, Dean was in another part of town at the time and did not see Benno. Benno sent some of the photos to his mother, Laura, who was concerned. She contacted a friend for advice. The friend suggested that Benno could be dangerous and advised Laura not to go to his apartment alone. Laura suspected that Benno's mental health had deteriorated due to his use of anabolic steroids. Benno was eventually taken away, and it was discovered that he had been self-harming due to hallucinations. After this incident, Nadine decided not to see him again, but he was discharged after only 3 days. During his stay, doctors did not have enough time to carry out all the necessary tests to diagnose his condition. It was suspected that Benno was schizophrenic, and his family insisted on further testing, but he refused and began taking medication for schizophrenia. By the time Benno's trial began, he had been diagnosed with acute polymorphic psychotic disorder rather than schizophrenia. This misdiagnosis meant that he was taking the wrong medication, which likely worsened his mental condition. While on steroids, he was taking a dangerous cocktail of drugs that affected his behavior. Immediately before the murder, Benno was released from the psychiatric hospital and returned home. During this time, his mother became extremely concerned for his safety. She hid all the knives in the house and locked the doors at night. She believed that as long as she did not provoke him, everything would be fine, so she tried to avoid arguments and limit her interactions with him. Unfortunately, this did not protect her from a tragic end. On November 19, 2022, Benno Neumayer was sentenced to life in prison. However, his lawyer quickly appealed the decision, arguing that Benno was insane due to a combination of negative factors that worsened his mental condition. To support the defense's claims, several independent medical assessments were conducted, which found him mentally stable. The prosecution pointed out that Benno acted deliberately, as he tried to create an alibi and conceal his actions. Just minutes after the murder, he called his girlfriend, pretending to be worried about his parents' absence. He ruthlessly deceived those around him, sending messages to his deceased mother, deceiving his sister and neighbors, all to escape justice. After the retrial, Benno's life sentence was upheld and remains in effect. The murders of Peter and Laura received considerable media attention in Italy and caused widespread public fear. Hello friends, welcome to our channel. Today we're going to take a look at another horrible case with you, the case of Mackenzie Shirilla. Mackenzie Shirilla was born in August 2004 in Strongsville, Ohio, the third of 3 children. Her parents, John Shilla and Natalie Stevens, made a conscious effort to raise their children with love, care, and a good education, always encouraging their endeavors. As the youngest daughter, Mackenzie was often spoiled and got away with many mischievous acts, including serious offenses, due to her parents' leniency. As she grew up, Mackenzie became a demanding and selfish individual. She was accustomed to getting her way and believed she was above consequences, no matter her actions. Classmates and teachers observed that Mackenzie was a pleasant and open child in her early years, but as she aged, her behavior and character began to deteriorate. She would throw tantrums when things didn't go her way, lost her temper easily, was impudent and impatient, used foul language, and was even known to get into physical altercations. Mackenzie refused to consider anyone else's opinions, always believing her own view to be the only one that mattered, and prioritized her own interests above all else. In her teenage years, Mackenzie's behavior became increasingly unbearable, but her parents turned a blind eye, attributing it to adolescence and believing that she needed understanding and patience. However, her defiant nature was only the tip of the iceberg. She developed a drinking problem in high school and occasionally dabbled in illegal substances, often getting away with it. Her reckless actions posed a direct threat not only to herself, but also to those around her. Despite this, her parents either failed to notice or chose to ignore the obvious issue. Like many of her peers, Mackenzie was obsessed with social media, rarely putting her phone down. She frequently posted provocative photos of herself smoking or drinking on her account, accompanied by equally provocative comments. Her friends were similar, and together they engaged in vandalism, organized fights, and occasionally stole from others, even catching the attention of the police on several occasions. However, they were merely given warnings and educational talks, which reinforced their belief that they were above the law. Dominic Russo, born in September 2001, was the 4th of 7 children to Frank and Christine Russo in Strongsville. Growing up in a close-knit family with 3 brothers and 3 sisters, Dominic received ample love, attention, and care despite being part of a large family. He excelled academically, actively participated in sports from a young age, and maintained a healthy lifestyle. His parents, Frank and Christine, struck a balance between being moderately strict and encouraging their children's overall development. As a result, Dominic was popular among his peers, often drew attention, and was known for his bright and attractive appearance. Focusing on meaningful connections, Dominic avoided casual relationships. After high school, he enrolled in a local university to pursue a degree in performing arts production, aiming to make a name for himself in the music industry. Dominic was a talented young man who wrote and performed his own songs. By the age of 20, Dominic had achieved significant milestones, establishing his own small business, buying a car, and renting a spacious apartment in a desirable neighborhood. He continued to excel in sports and was regarded as one of the top students at the university. Dominic and Mackenzie first met at a party surrounded by mutual friends when she was in her graduating class. This chance encounter proved to be a pivotal moment in their lives. As total opposites, they were instinctively attracted to each other. Dominic, a handsome young man with curly hair and a passion for music, immediately caught Mackenzie's attention. Unlike the guys she usually hung out with, he was educated, well-mannered, and interesting, able to converse on various topics. Mackenzie, a stunning woman with a slim figure and impeccable style, knew how to make a lasting impression. She turned on her charm to grab Dominic's attention, which she quickly achieved. The two started dating in the fall of 2021 and soon introduced each other to their parents. While Mackenzie's parents were thrilled with her choice and thought Dominic was perfect for their daughter, Dominic's parents, Frank and Christine Russo, had mixed feelings about Mackenzie. On the surface, she appeared sweet and innocent, trying to impress them, but something about her raised their suspicions. Mackenzie's friends and family believed she had genuinely fallen in love for the first time and hoped her relationship with Dominic would positively impact her character and behavior. At the time, no one could have predicted the tragic outcome of this romance. They quickly became inseparable, regularly holding hands and openly showing their affection in public. As a result, it didn't take long for the news of their relationship to spread throughout the small town. While those closest to Mackenzie felt sympathy for her boyfriend, most people were genuinely happy for they. However, Dominic soon realized that something was off. He began to notice strange behaviors in Mackenzie, such as her frequent outbursts of defiance and her insistence on getting her way in all interactions. At first, he didn't give it much thought, attributing it to her young age and desire for attention. They started making plans for their future together, including discussing marriage once Mackenzie turned 18. They also planned to leave their hometown and move to a major city, ideally New York, where Dominic could pursue a successful music career. As time went on, Mackenzie's behavior grew more and more unsettling, sometimes even scaring Dominic. She demanded that her boyfriend give in to her every demand, and when he refused, she would throw tantrums, acting like a spoiled kid. At first, Dominic tried to brush off her outbursts as a joke, but soon realized that this was the real personality of the woman he was dating. While she was able to keep up a good front in public, when they were alone, she would let loose a flood of emotions and even get physically violent. Mackenzie's behavior became increasingly aggressive, leading the young man to decide he'd had enough. He suggested they take a break to allow her to sort out her feelings, but this triggered a public outburst in front of their mutual friends. Mackenzie screamed, threatened to kill him if he left, and vowed to burn down his house and wreck his car. However, this dramatic display only reinforced his conviction that ending their toxic relationship was the right decision. Despite this, Mackenzie was determined to hold on to her boyfriend. She continued to call him, inviting him to parties and posting photos of them on social media with declarations of love. When Dominic made it clear that everything was over, she flew into a rage. Mackenzie began showing up at his house almost daily, yelling insults and threats under his windows. She called him from different numbers, left messages on his answering machine, and sent emails and social media posts. One moment, she'd swear her love and offer to start anew. The next, she'd descend into insults and threats once again. Dominic was utterly bewildered by Mackenzie's behavior, which he had never experienced before. He attempted to engage in conversation with her, ignoring her, and even recording her aggressive outbursts on his phone. However, Mackenzie's conduct escalated to the point where she would publicly confront Dominic, screaming and insulting him in front of bystanders. This turned his life into a living hell, but he still held on to the hope that with time, she would lose interest and move on to someone else. One day, in the presence of witnesses, Mackenzie brazenly declared that killing Dominic would be easier than letting him go. She threatened that if he didn't return to her, no one else would have him. and she would take care of it. Although Dominic didn't take her threats seriously, those around him recognized that Mackenzie was dead serious. The schoolgirl frequently issuing menace included promises to physically assault him, run him over with a car, kidnap him and drive off a cliff, or stop the car on train tracks in front of an oncoming train. Each sinister scenario was described in vivid detail, as if Mackenzie had meticulously planned it and was waiting for the perfect moment to execute it. Mackenzie realized that threatening and insulting Dominic wasn't getting him back, but rather pushing him away. So she changed her approach. She became sweet and charming once more, stopped pressuring and harassing him, and pretended to have learned from her mistakes, wanting to improve herself for the better. She brought up the upcoming university enrollment, asking for his help in choosing a university, and even claimed to be worried about her final exams. Dominic was pleasantly surprised by these changes and, despite everything, still had feelings for his former girlfriend. He decided to help her with enrollment, simply out of kindness. As a result, they started seeing each other and communicating again. They grew closer over time. Dominic began inviting Mackenzie on dates and sought to spend all his free time with her, believing she had changed, matured, and become more responsible. Without realizing it, he fell in love with her again, and all past grievances were forgotten. This time, however, they didn't rush to announce their reunion to friends and acquaintances. Their meetings were more like secret dates, where they simply enjoyed each other's company, avoiding the scrutiny of others. When Dominic's brother Angelo found out what was going on, he warned that their relationship would not end well. But Dominic, being deeply in love, ignored his brother's caution. Meanwhile, Mackenzie, who was obsessed with Dominic, devised a terrifying plan to take revenge on him. She began to fantasize about a high-speed car crash and spent hours driving around the city to find the perfect spot to put her plan into action. Since there were no steep cliffs nearby, she considered targeting a train on the tracks, but eventually decided it was too unreliable. One day, Mackenzie drove into a secluded industrial area with no cameras and very few cars. There, she spotted a massive brick wall, which sparked a new, equally horrific plan in her mind. She decided that if she drove at maximum speed and crashed into the wall, it would be just as sensational as plunging off a cliff. Initially, Mackenzie intended to die alongside Dominic, hoping their tragic story would be told and retold by everyone in the city. She even confided in her best friend, but her friend didn't take her seriously, thinking it was just another empty threat. Mackenzie had made similar claims before, but never followed through. In late July 2022, Mackenzie suggested to her boyfriend Dominic that they attend an upcoming party hosted by their mutual friends, just a week shy of her 18th birthday. The party would be a perfect opportunity for them to have fun, unwind, and publicly showcase their rekindled romance. Dominic agreed, still trusting Mackenzie's sincerity and intentions. The party took place on Saturday, July 30th. Mackenzie and Dominic arrived hand in hand, immediately drawing attention from the other guests. They looked happy, smiled, and openly displayed their affection for each other. Their friends were genuinely delighted with their reunion, noting that they made a lovely and harmonious couple. Throughout the evening and night, the young pair had a blast, happily took photos, and unhesitatingly kissed in front of everyone. Little did anyone know, this joyful celebration would soon turn into a devastating tragedy. Like the other partygoers, they had a few drinks, but Mackenzie secretly took an illegal drug to boost her courage and avoid getting cold feet. The next morning, Mackenzie and Dominic bid farewell to their friends and headed to their car, but Dominic's friend Dave requested a ride home. Mackenzie initially objected, citing their own plans, but Dominic saw no issue with giving his friend a lift, not wanting to arouse suspicion or alter their plans. Mackenzie reluctantly agreed, despite her reservations about the change in plans. Mackenzie got behind the wheel, her boyfriend sat in the passenger seat, and her friend sat behind him. With a slow and quiet start, the car pulled away from the party venue and headed onto Main Street. Mackenzie drove cautiously, keeping to the speed limit and avoiding drawing attention to herself. At a stoplight, she came to a halt, even though the road was empty. As her passengers dozed off, Mackenzie reconsidered her plan. She would later claim that she wanted to die in the accident. But this seems unlikely since she had fastened her seatbelt during the last stop, while her passengers remained unbuckled. When the light turned green, she accelerated quickly, taking a sharp turn onto a poorly lit secondary road that led into an industrial area. The guys were caught off guard, seemingly unaware of what was happening. The car sped up to its top speed, but Mackenzie continued to floor it, steering the vehicle straight into a blank brick wall. The crash occurred in the deserted industrial area early Sunday morning, with no witnesses or Good Samaritans to help. However, a woman living on the outskirts, near the accident site, heard the impact and went outside to investigate. She saw smoke and, upon closer inspection, realized that a car had crashed. After the accident, she rushed back inside to call emergency services. About half an hour later, medics arrived at the scene, but unfortunately, the two men in the car had died instantly. The girl driving the car, however, was still alive, thanks to her seatbelt and airbags. Mackenzie was unconscious, with her legs trapped in the wreckage, but she was breathing and had a palpable pulse, giving hope that she would survive. During the rescue process, she occasionally opened her eyes, but seemed unaware of her surroundings. Mackenzie was rushed to the hospital, where doctors diagnosed her with multiple fractures and internal organ damage. Blood tests revealed that she had been under the influence of both alcohol and drugs at the time of the accident. Ironically, the doctor believed that this may have helped prevent her from dying from shock while waiting for help to arrive. The police investigation initially suggested that Mackenzie, while under the influence, might not have realized what she was doing, and perhaps tried to drive through the wall or didn't see any obstacles. This theory was supported by the lack of braking distance. However, Mackenzie was unable to provide further insight as she was unconscious in the intensive care unit following a complex operation. Mackenzie regained consciousness and, overcome with emotion, confessed to the doctor on duty. She explained that she had intentionally driven into the wall at high speed, intending to kill her boyfriend and die with him. She clarified that Davin was an unintended victim, only in the car because of his own obsession, having asked to accompany them. Investigations revealed a different story. Surveillance footage tracked the initial part of the car's route, showing Mackenzie driving cautiously and following traffic rules, until she suddenly turned onto a road leading to an industrial area. Moreover, evidence emerged that Mackenzie had driven the entire route in both directions several days prior, with her car spotted by at least a dozen witnesses at various times. After leaving the hospital, Mackenzie bounced back quickly and resumed her carefree life. She socialized with friends, made future plans, and even attended a concert in a wheelchair, posting selfies on social media. By Halloween, she was back on her feet and dressed in costume, living life to the fullest. Mackenzie was arrested on November 4th, 2022. The investigation took just over 3 months to gather evidence and build a case against her. She was charged with premeditated aggravated double murder and possession of a controlled substance, which was found in her pocket and detected in her blood. During the trial, Mackenzie changed her story multiple times. Initially, she claimed to have suffered a memory lapse, but after a friend testified against her, revealing her plan, Mackenzie shifted her defense, stating she wanted to die with her lover. However, this new claim was quickly disputed, as evidence showed she had worn a seatbelt. On August 21, 2023, the jury found Mackenzie guilty on all charges. Although she was convicted, the court took into account that she was not yet 18 years old at the time of the crime, only 5 days shy of her 18th birthday. As a minor under state law, she was eligible for a more lenient sentence. Mackenzie faced 2 consecutive 15-year sentences without parole for each murder. However, due to her youth, her sentences were allowed to run concurrently, making her eligible for parole in 15 years. At the time of her potential release, Mackenzie will be 33 years old. The court's decision left both sides dissatisfied. The families of the deceased youths announced their intention to appeal for a harsher punishment, while Mackenzie's lawyer felt the sentence was too severe and also appealed. Despite this, the judge refused to modify the sentence, stating that he doubted Cheryl would be released from prison after 15 years. In his view, the defendant had failed to show remorse for her crime, displaying arrogance and even contempt towards the court, and now had ample time to reflect on her heinous act. Hello friends, welcome to our channel. Today we're going to take a look at another horrible case with you. The case of Rachel O'Reilly. Rachel O'Reilly was born in 1974 in County Dublin, Ireland. Her biological parents are unknown, but she was adopted at a young age by Rose and Jim Calley, who raised her along with their 4 other adopted children. Rachel was a responsible and driven child. She excelled in school, played sports, helped with household chores, and never caused any trouble. As she grew up, she became a sociable, open, and exceptionally kind person. She got along with everyone and avoided conflict whenever possible. As a teenager, Rachel was a skilled softball player, participating in numerous competitions and setting local records. Her closest relationship was with her adoptive mother, Rose, with whom she shared all her secrets and stayed in close touch even after she got married and had children of her own. Rachel decided to pursue a degree in marketing from a local university after completing high school. She also landed a job as a salesperson at a city department store and continued to play sports for a local team in her free time. Joe O'Reilly, born in 1972 in County Dublin, Joe grew up in a simple family as the second child of his parents, with an older sister. His parents instilled in him the value of hard work and self-reliance, not spoiling him or his sister. Joe was a tall and athletic boy who enjoyed playing softball. After high school, he chose to study advertising through correspondence and took a job as a manager at a department store. A few months later, Rachel would start working at the same store. Joe was 19 years old when he first met Rachel, who was just 17. He was immediately drawn to her and introduced himself, but despite being charmed by her bright smile and blonde hair, she refused to go on a date with him. Undeterred, Joe began to try to win her over, showering her with compliments and small gifts, such as flowers and chocolates, which he would leave at her workstation in the morning. However, no matter how hard he tried, Rachel remained unimpressed. The entire department store staff was entertained by Joe's attempts to get Rachel's attention, and it even became a running joke. Despite initial challenges, Joe persevered. He made an effort to read Rachel's favorite book, hoping to find common ground for conversation. However, it wasn't until he discovered her passion for softball that he made significant progress. Joe attended one of her games, joined in during practice, and showcased his skills on the field. As a result, the team won, and Rachel was finally impressed by his determination and athletic abilities. She agreed to go on a date with him, and their relationship began to blossom. As they spent more time together, Joe went to great lengths to prove his commitment and affection. He planned a surprise trip to Paris, a city he knew Rachel would love. In a romantic gesture, he proposed to her at the top of the Eiffel Tower. Rachel was overwhelmed by the surprise and happily accepted his proposal. She thought she had found her perfect match, a true prince who would make her happy for the rest of her life. A few years after their wedding, they had 2 sons. They moved to a peaceful and scenic area in Scotland, where they bought a spacious and cozy home, ideal for raising their children. After the birth of their first son, Rachel left her job to focus on taking care of her family. 2 years later, their second son was born, and Rachel dedicated herself to raising their children. Meanwhile, Joe secured a job at an advertising agency, specializing in outdoor advertising, which proved to be a successful career move for him. Those who knew Joe personally described him as a confident, driven, and charming individual. At work, he demonstrated his responsibility, expertise, and attention to detail. As they grew older and started attending kindergarten, Rachel began working as a distributor for a popular cosmetics company and selling household goods to earn extra income. This job allowed her to interact more with her neighbors, who praised her as a wonderful mother and a kind, open person. Meanwhile, Joe became increasingly absent from home, only returning to sleep, shower, and change clothes. He attributed his absence to his demanding work schedule and an upcoming promotion he was eagerly anticipating. Rachel supported Joe as best she could, but as time passed, they started to drift apart, and their family relationships began to deteriorate significantly. A disturbing incident occurred in the summer of 2004 when an anonymous person sent a letter to Child Protective Services, falsely accusing Rachel of being a bad mother who mistreated her sons. In response, a special commission visited their home to investigate the allegations. Although the investigation found no evidence of wrongdoing, and relatives and neighbors described Rachel as a loving and caring mother, the malicious letter damaged her reputation. On the morning of Monday, October 4, 2004, the O'Reilly household began as usual. Joe, the father, left for work at dawn while his wife, Rachel, and their sons were still asleep. Throughout the day, Joe tried to contact Rachel by texting and calling her, but she didn't respond. He then called their home phone, but the answering machine picked up, and Joe left a worried message, asking Rachel to call him back as soon as possible. Later that afternoon, Joe received a call from the kindergarten teacher, informing him that Rachel had not arrived to pick up their sons, which was unusual. Joe then called his mother-in-law, Rose, to ask if she knew Rachel's whereabouts. When Rose said she didn't know, Joe asked her to check on their house and see if everything was okay. Meanwhile, Joe went to the kindergarten to pick up the children. When Rose arrived at the house, she found Rachel's car in the yard, indicating that Rachel was home. However, the house was dark and quiet, and Rose's calls went unanswered. As Rose entered the house, she was immediately struck by the scene of chaos before her. Cabinets and drawers were open, with their contents scattered all over the floor, giving the appearance of a robbery. Upon entering the bedroom, Rose's was met with a horrific sight. Rachel lay lifeless on the floor, surrounded by a massive pool of her own blood. The walls, furniture, and even the ceiling were splattered with blood, and Rachel's tangled, bloody hair partially concealed her skull. In some places, the bare bones of her skull were visible. Rose rushed to her daughter, hoping against hope that she was still alive and could be saved. But when she touched Rachel's arm, she felt it was cold and stiff. It was clear that Rachel had been dead for hours, and there was nothing that could be done to help her. Overcome with grief and unable to collect her thoughts, Rose began screaming and calling for help. She then rushed to the phone to dial the police. Her screams alerted the neighbors, one of whom was a doctor. The doctor was the first to examine the body and confirm that Rachel was beyond help. When Joe arrived at the house, he was met with a crowd of people who had already gathered there. Upon learning of his wife's death, he was overcome with grief, screaming and running inside the house, exclaiming that he didn't believe the news. In the bedroom, he became hysterical beside his wife's body, crying and vowing to kill the person responsible for her murder. According to the police officers who responded to the scene, the crime was one of the most brutal they had ever encountered. The victim, Rachel, had been beaten to death with a heavy blunt object with incredible force. It appeared that she had been attacked from behind, as she showed no signs of having tried to resist or fight back. At first, the scene resembled a robbery, but the investigators' instincts suggested that the brutality of the attack indicated a personal motive or intense dislike. However, it was unclear who would have wanted to harm the Rachel, who was a mother of two. The detectives began by interviewing Rachel's family members and neighbors, who all confirmed that she was a friendly person with no known enemies or conflicts. None of the neighbors reported seeing or hearing anything suspicious on the day of the murder. Joe provided an alibi, stating that he was at the bus depot on the other side of town for work, which could be corroborated by a coworker. The scene looked like a robbery, but nothing valuable was taken. A 1,000 euro note was left untouched on the bedside table, and another stash of money was found in a kitchen cupboard, also untouched. A jewelry box on the dressing table was disturbed, but only a pair of chains and earrings were missing, found separately in a drawer. The homeowner reported that a digital camera, silverware, and one of his dumbbells, likely the murder weapon, were missing. The investigation found the situation suspicious. The house was in disarray, and Rachel was brutally murdered, yet only a few items were taken. Joe, answering police questions, was visibly shaken, crying, and feverish. However, one investigator believed that Joe's behavior seemed more like nervous excitement than grief or shock. When asked if his wife might have had an affair, Joe's demeanor changed, and he confidently denied it. He then added that he had not cheated on his wife, but this statement seemed unconvincing. A bag containing stolen items from the house was discovered in the bushes, 2 miles from the crime scene. The bag held a camera, silverware, and a few pieces of jewelry, all of which were on the list of stolen items compiled by Joe. This new evidence led investigators to rule out the possibility of a robbery and reclassify the case as a premeditated murder. As a result, Joe, who had been trying to appear grief-stricken, became the prime suspect. His attempts to convey pain and sorrow seemed insincere, raising suspicions about his involvement in the crime. Joe didn't have an alibi to present, so the detectives had to investigate the details of his day to piece together what happened. According to Joe, he started the morning by stopping at the gym, a routine he followed regularly. The surveillance cameras in the gym's parking lot and inside the gym confirmed his presence. After his gym visit, Joe drove to the office and then headed to a remote bus station in the city to check on the placement of advertisements on buses. A colleague corroborated Joe's account, recalling a phone conversation they had around that time. The investigators then visited Joe's workplace to inspect his computer. This led to a significant discovery. Joe's email contained some suspicious messages that he had partially deleted. Specialists were able to recover the deleted emails, and the police became convinced they were on the right track. Most of the recovered emails were exchanges with Joe's friend and sister, in which he frequently complained about his wife, Rachel, using derogatory language and profanity. Joe's wife had not been attractive to him for a long time, and in fact, he felt a strong sense of disgust towards her. Meanwhile, investigators discovered a suspicious correspondence between Joe and a female colleague named Nikki Pell. Their communication suggested that they were more than just friends and warranted further questioning. Nikki Pell worked at the same advertising company as Joe and was 10 years his senior. Despite their age difference, they had begun an affair. It was unclear when exactly their workplace romance started, but it was evident that Joe spent a significant amount of time with Nikki, often staying late into the evenings and even nights. Joe's wife was unaware of this and was misled into believing that he was busy with work. What was even more alarming was the content of Joe's messages to Nikki, in which he promised that they would soon be together, referring to her as a potential stepmother to his children with his wife, Rachel. Such messages raised suspicions, especially considering that in the event of a divorce, the children would likely remain with their mother. Joe initially denied having an affair, but when faced with irrefutable evidence of his infidelity, he was forced to admit to secretly dating Nikki for some time. Although they had reportedly broken up for over a week before the incident, this revelation raised questions. Following the discovery of the body, the O'Reilly house was sealed off as a crime scene, and no one was allowed to enter while the police conducted a thorough investigation. During this time, Joe stayed with his sister, and the children stayed with their grandparents. At the funeral, Joe was surprisingly calm and appeared to avoid the casket containing his deceased wife's body. When it was his turn to say goodbye, he did so hastily and without emotion. As he left, he appeared unconcerned, saying that the casket could be closed and buried once the family was allowed to return home. When they returned, everything in the house appeared to be in the same condition as the day of the murder, except for the body on the floor. Joe asked his in-laws to accompany him to the scene of the crime, and they agreed, thinking he needed their emotional support. However, as they walked around the room where Rachel had been murdered, Joe began to speculate about the killer's actions. He graphically described the attack, pointing to dried blood spatters and reenacting the blows with his arms. Joe suggested that the perpetrator might have washed his hands and the crime weapon in the bathroom before taking it with him. Although his detailed and unsettling account seemed like an attempt to process his grief, his parents-in-law couldn't shake the feeling that he was reenacting the crime. Rose, in particular, secretly suspected that Joe might have been the one who killed their daughter. Immediately following the funeral, Joe began aggressively seeking media attention. He granted numerous interviews and even invited reporters into his home, providing them with a tour of the crime scene while recounting the events that transpired. 3 weeks after the tragedy, the Rachel loved ones agreed to participate in a television program about the crime. However, while Rachel's parents appeared to be overcome with grief, Joe's behavior on set was remarkably different. He interacted with the makeup team, showing concern for his on-camera appearance, and during breaks, he eagerly accepted and enjoyed the offered snacks and coffee, behaving more like a celebrity than a grieving family member. The police, who were still looking at Joe, decided to follow him and found that from the set he went straight to his mistress Nikki, who spent the night. By that time, the last doubts that he was the killer had already been dispelled, and it remained only to collect irrefutable evidence for the court. Collecting evidence proved to be a time-consuming and challenging task. The main piece of evidence, the murder weapon, remained elusive. Despite this, investigators accumulated enough supplementary evidence. Initially, 2 key witnesses, Nikki and Joe's colleague who corroborated his alibi, faced possible imprisonment for perjury, leading them to recant their earlier statements. Nikki revealed that her relationship with Joe never actually ended. They continued to see each other in secret. Rachel, who discovered their ongoing connection, got into a significant argument with Joe and his wife shortly before the tragedy. In contrast, Joe's colleague, although previously vouching for his whereabouts, could not confidently attest that Joe was at the bus station across town at the time of his wife's murder. He unknowingly corroborated his friend's story at his request, unaware that Joe was a suspect in the crime at the time. Emails retrieved from Joe's computer, in which he made disparaging comments about his wife and planned a future with his mistress and children, were also submitted as evidence in the case. Joe made a deliberate attempt to create an alibi by going to the gym and ensuring he was caught on camera. He then informed his colleagues that he would be unavailable due to a work commitment in another part of the city. However, instead of going to the bus station as claimed, Joe went home, armed himself with a dumbbell, and hid in the bedroom, waiting for his wife to return from taking the children to kindergarten. He launched a surprise attack on her from behind, leaving her no opportunity to defend herself. After committing the crime, Joe, who later admitted his actions, cleaned the blood from himself and the murder weapon in the bathroom next to the bedroom. He then changed his clothes, scattered his belongings around the house to make it appear like a robbery had occurred, and headed to work. While on his way to the office, Joe got rid of the items he had taken, disposed of the bloody clothes and dumbbells, and made several attempts to cover his tracks by calling his wife's phone, sending her messages, and leaving voicemails asking her to call him back. At the office, Joe exhibited unusual behavior, appearing overly excited and showing signs of nervousness, as evident from his slightly shaking hands. Some of his colleagues noticed his unusual behavior and asked if he was okay, but Joe seemed flustered and, instead of responding, quickly retreated to his office. Shortly after, he received a call from the daycare center informing him that no one had picked up their boys. Instead of rushing home, Joe sent his mother-in-law to discover his daughter's disfigured body first. He believed he had covered his tracks and that his guilt would be impossible to prove. However, his desire for fame and public attention ultimately worked against him. Although most of the evidence against Joe was circumstantial, he was not arrested until 2 years after the crime. His guilt was ultimately proven by tracing his movements on the day of the murder, using data from a cell phone he had kept with him. Notably, at the time of the murder, Joe's cell phone signal was tracked to the home, a fact later confirmed by phone records. Furthermore, it was revealed during the trial that the anonymous letter sent to Child Protective Services, which made false accusations against Rachel, was actually written by Joe's mother at his request. Joe's motive for the murder was to gain sole custody of the children in the event of a divorce. To achieve this, he attempted to discredit Rachel by portraying her as an abusive mother. However, social services found no evidence to support these claims, and Joe decided to take more drastic action. Joe showed no remorse in the courtroom, smiling and chatting with his lawyers as if he was confident he would be acquitted. However, in the summer of 2007, the court delivered a guilty verdict and sentenced him to life in prison. Despite the defense team's efforts to appeal the decision, all their attempts were unsuccessful. Interestingly, Joe's relationship with his mistress, Nikki, continued even after his imprisonment. She visited him regularly for many years, but they suddenly lost contact in 2022. Throughout his imprisonment, Joe has maintained his innocence and has been a model inmate, never causing any trouble. He hopes that this good behavior will eventually make him eligible for parole. Hello again, true crime fans. We've got another mysterious case to explore. The case of the Foster family. Christopher Foster had always been considered a success. His mother, Enid, described him as someone who actively pursued financial opportunities from an early age. Along with his younger brother, Andrew, he aspired to follow in the footsteps of their late father, who had been a sales manager. Although they both aimed to become successful businessmen, Chris and Andrew had had a tense relationship since they were children. Andrew later explained that Chris's confidence and assertiveness had overshadowed Andrew's quiet nature. Despite this, both brothers were very close to their mother, Enid. In 1987, Chris married Jill, a housewife, and they had their daughter Kirsty in 1993. Chris's path to wealth began in the late 80s when he worked as a mattress salesman and used inexpensive pizza boxes for insulation. His life changed dramatically after he founded a successful engineering company. This business made Chris a self-made millionaire through the development of an innovative insulation material that became essential in the oil industry. The Piper Alpha oil rig explosion on July 6, 1988, had led to a catastrophic fire that lasted for days and claimed the lives of 167 people. After watching the news, Chris saw an opportunity in this tragedy and identified a market niche for fireproof insulation specifically for oil and gas rigs. Although many oil companies showed interest, they wanted certification of the product's effectiveness before signing a contract. To prove its value, Chris took the financial risk of mortgaging his house to fund an experiment. The test was successful. His product, Overshield, showed exceptional resilience compared to other insulation materials when exposed to fire. It even received a rare A1 fire test rating. Major oil companies quickly placed orders, making Christopher Foster a millionaire almost overnight. Reports suggested that he earned so much money that he didn't know how to spend it all. As his business grew, Christopher's annual turnover increased significantly from £50,000 to £1 million. By 2004, Chris's net worth had been reported to be £10 million. That same year, his wife Jill noticed a house in Shropshire Life magazine. It was Usbaston House, a beautiful mansion in Maesbrook, a wealthy village in Shropshire, England. The estate was 16 acres in size, had its own lake and equestrian grounds. Despite being offered at around £1.5 million, the house still needed repairs. Jill was so intrigued that Chris made an offer the next morning. Foster's family quickly sold their house and moved to Usbaston House. Chris then invested a further £50,000 to install a swimming pool and landscape the property. After settling down, Chris led a lavish lifestyle. He bought 2 Porsches, one for himself and one for Jill, a James Bond-style Aston Martin, Range Rovers, and many other vehicles. Their daughter Kirsty attended a private boarding school, and Chris also bought her several horses. Kirsty spent time with her horses when not at school and participated in equestrian competitions. Friends described her as quiet, thoughtful, and kind. In addition, Chris also bought 4 dogs and several pigeons. He further enhanced their lives by hiring a butler and a personal assistant, and the house had antique furniture worth more than £200,000. Chris's most expensive hobby was his passion for shooting, demonstrated by his expensive gun collection, each costing between £12,000 and £12,500, equivalent to nearly $20,000 at the time. Chris often attended shooting parties that could last 3 days, with bills running up to £8,000. He had a habit of leaving guns around the house. Occasionally, when pigeons made a mess of Chris's car, he would shoot them, much to Jill's frustration. In one disturbing incident, when Kirsty's black Labrador began disturbing the sheep, Chris was unable to control the dog and let it down a country road to shoot it in the head. Chris was a successful businessman but lacked a long-term vision. Notoriously impulsive, he craved instant gratification and was quick to cut ties with people who annoyed him. Chris enjoyed being admired and envied by others for his wealth, and social status was very important to him. Over time, both Chris and Jill moved up the social ladder, and it became clear to those close to Chris that he wanted to move away from his roots in Wolverhampton. Jill enjoyed shopping sprees and spent her days doing self-care activities like nail and hair appointments, along with beauty treatments like manicures and Botox injections. Chris and his family regularly went on luxury vacations, staying in luxury hotels and enjoying the best food. These lavish trips could sometimes cost up to £20,000 each, and Chris didn't hesitate to pay. However, unbeknownst to his friends and family, Chris had reached his financial limit and began withdrawing money from his business. His excessive spending had led to financial imbalance, with more money going out than coming in. In 2003, Chris had signed an exclusive contract with DRC, giving them the exclusive rights to produce his oil rig sealant. By 2004, his net worth had been reported to be £1 million. However, by 2005, he owed £2.8 million. Instead of cutting costs, Chris, due to his lavish spending habits, sought more money from other sources. Despite the exclusive agreement with DRC, he signed another contract with another company to sell his products. DRC discovered this infringement and sued Chris, resulting in a lawsuit and DRC acquiring Chris's patent. Chris went bankrupt, and in 2007, his company was dissolved. His assets worth £3 million were frozen and his salary was gone. Despite serious financial troubles, Chris continued to act as if nothing significant had happened. At the same time, Chris became involved in a dispute with his accountant, who reported him to the Inland Revenue for tax evasion. Chris had failed to pay VAT, national insurance, and various other taxes. To deal with his increasing tax obligations, he had to borrow from banks to ease his financial strain. In addition, he had mortgaged the Usbaston house 3 times and withdrawn money from more than 20 different bank accounts. Despite his lavish lifestyle and constant spending, Chris still tried to hide the fact that he was deeply in debt. Chris gradually found himself struggling with overwhelming challenges, aware that time was ticking away and fearful of losing everything. However, during a conversation with a friend about houses, Chris insisted that he would never sell us Baston house. Struggling with the pressure to maintain his flashy and knowing that his time and money were running out, Chris repeatedly sought professional help. He confided in the doctor, revealing his feelings of depression and suicidal thoughts. He started taking antidepressants. In August 2008, Chris came across a letter from his house managers posted on the front gate. The letter reported that they planned to return the following Tuesday to reclaim the house and other assets. The housekeeper said that when she showed Chris the letter, Chris appeared confused but remained silent. The nightmare that Chris had been avoiding had now become a harsh reality. He was on the brink of losing all his material possessions. The thought of Kirsty and Jill losing their familiar lifestyle was unbearable for Christopher. His family faced the possibility of returning to Wolverhampton, saying goodbye to their lavish lifestyle. For a proud man like Chris, such a situation would have been extremely humiliating. On August 21, 2008, a friend contacted Chris via text message to ask about his health, and he replied, "Not good, things are about to happen to me." On August 25, 2008, the Foster's family received an invitation to a barbecue and clay pigeon shooting event. They then joined the gathering. None of the attendees noticed any signs of difficulty in the Fosters. Witnesses recalled that Chris appeared happy. Their family still exuded happiness without knowing what Chris had planned that night. Chris informed Jill that he wanted to leave the gathering. Although Jill wanted to stay a little longer, they eventually left around 8:30 p.m., arriving home just a few minutes later at 8:44 p.m., their route captured by home security footage. Soon after, Jill went to bed. At 11:30 p.m., Chris went upstairs to check on Kirsty, urging her to go to bed while continuing to text a friend online. Around midnight, Chris decided to turn off the internet, causing Kirsty to end her conversation with her friend and go to bed. At 3 a.m., Chris began his violent rampage. He entered Jill's room and used a silencer to shoot her in the head while she was sleeping. Next, he went to Kirsty's room and killed her in the same way. Home security cameras recorded Chris's actions as he carried a shotgun outside the dog cage, killing each dog with a shot to the head. He then went to the stables and killed the horses before burning the stables with the animals inside. Chris appeared expressionless in the video. To prevent firefighters from reaching the house, Chris blocked the main entrance, shooting at the tires to make movement more difficult. He also pumped 200 liters of oil from the family's tank into the house's basement through connecting pipes. It is clear that Chris took deliberate steps to completely destroy the Baston house. His actions appeared to have been motivated by a desire to prevent others from acquiring property that he could not keep. Chris burned down his house and covered his car and belongings in oil. The fire quickly spread and destroyed everything. Chris, still carrying a rifle, went back into the house and lay down next to Jill's body in the bedroom, holding her as flames engulfed them. At 4:11 a.m., the security cameras stopped working. A neighbor saw the growing fire and called for help. Firefighters quickly arrived. The fire was too intense and difficult to control. As firefighters tried to put out the fire, neighbors watched the building burn, worried for those inside. In the following days, the media called in to search for Foster's family, but all efforts were unsuccessful. Because of Chris's wealth, the authorities opened an investigation, initially suspecting that the Foster family had been kidnapped. However, at the time, neither the bodies nor the security footage were found, so many speculated about what might have happened to them. It took 3 days for the fire to be completely extinguished. After the fire was extinguished, investigators carefully examined the house and found the bodies of Jill and Christopher on beds in a room that had collapsed into the living room. However, there was no sign of Kirsty. While some hoped she could have escaped, others feared she had been kidnapped. Sadly, Kirsty's remains were found in the rubble a few days later. Investigators used a brush to carefully collect her remains into a hearse. A fragment of Kirsty's skull revealed that she had suffered a gunshot wound to the head, like her mother. After examining the body, the police began to suspect that Chris had committed a crime. At the same time, they began investigating his financial situation. When they dug deeper, they discovered that Chris, a seemingly successful businessman, was actually heavily in debt. His total debt had reached £4 million, and when creditors tried to take his assets, they discovered that Chris had intended to demolish the house to ensure that there was nothing left for them to take. Security footage confirmed the police's suspicions. Chris committed the murders and took his own life without leaving any explanation or warning. Speculation about the motives behind the brutal crime led to two main theories. One theory had suggested that Chris, feeling ashamed of having lost his fortune, chose to commit the heinous act to avoid admitting his failures. Another theory had proposed that Chris, being self-centered, decided to destroy everything rather than face the possibility of loss. However, Enid had disagreed with these theories. She had firmly believed that Chris acted out of love for his family, trying to protect them from financial ruin. She had defended him and felt a deep sense of sympathy for his situation. In contrast, Chris's brother Andrew had held a very different view. Despite not speaking for 16 years, Andrew had briefly considered reconciling with Chris for their mother's sake. However, his fear of a hostile encounter had kept him from reaching out. Andrew had alleged that Chris had bullied and sexually assaulted him during their childhood, leading to a tumultuous relationship. Andrew had maintained that Chris exhibited bullying and controlling behavior. Andrew's attempts to reconcile with Chris in 1999 had been met with resistance. Chris had responded to Andrew's letter with a demand for a written apology, stating that Andrew would have to beg and scrape on bended knee to make amends. Andrew had believed that Chris refused to acknowledge his past wrongdoings and instead held on to long-standing grudges. For months after the tragedy, on December 19, 2008, a joint funeral had been held for 15-year-old Kirsty and 49-year-old Jill at their local village church. The service had been quiet and respectful, attended by close friends and family. Both Kirsty and Jill had been buried in the same plot, as requested by Jill's family. Chris had received a private funeral and was buried elsewhere. In the years following the tragedy, the remains of the burnt-out house and the family's charred belongings had been left on the site. These had included Kirsty's first aid book for her horses and a handwritten note detailing the family's meal plans for the week of the tragedy. The ruins of the house had remained until 2011 when the debris had been cleared. The 16-acre estate had been sold in 2014, with plans to build a new 6-bedroom house. Although the property had been put up for sale in 2012, it had taken 2 years to sell, reportedly after the price had been reduced. The reasons behind Christopher Foster's actions may have been financial struggles and the pressure to maintain a wealthy image. However, this had not justified the horrific outcome. Instead of having made sensible financial decisions or confiding in his loved ones, Chris had chosen a destructive path that had had devastating consequences for everyone involved.